Welcome, Hop Nation Podcast. Very happy to have you back and happy to have my guest, Aaron.Halliday, here today. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Let me tell our guests a little bit about you today, Aaron. Aaron has his PhD. He's president, partner, and co-founder of Trust Inc. And I like the title he has on LinkedIn, Data Scientist. That was something that kind of resonated with me. But I'll read a little bit of his bio here for the benefit of the listeners. He's a published author and reviewer for the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences, a certified executive coach, and a professionally trained scientist practitioner, or as I often have said on this podcast, a pracademic, balancing both the research side with the practical applications of the use of research. His background in industrial organizational psychology allows him to use best practices in science and evidence-based management to help organizations and individuals overcome challenges, prevent problems, and promote psychology and the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals, organizations, and communities to thrive, and how these findings may be used to benefit all levels of social systems, from individuals to societies. His proactive focus on striving for healthy individual and organizational functioning goes beyond meeting the needs of your organization. It cultivates opportunities for you and your organization members to grow and thrive. Now, I know there was a bit of background story before that bio in terms of your upbringing in a small factory town, which led to kind of the path you're on. So with that, why don't you tell me a bit about your founder's story and how you got into the research path you went on and the motivation behind that, and then how you're transitioning that into the practice you have in Toronto now with your business partner, Trust Inc.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess it kind of started when I was fairly young. My parents, as you mentioned, were a part of a factory community. They went and they were working factory jobs. My grandparents were factory workers, and I realized at a very young age how much of a struggle that they actually had in their day-to-day work lives. There was layoffs common, especially when I was young, and secure work was not as much of a thing, especially for one of my parents in particular, my father. And that's it brings on a lot of uncertainty. It brings on a lot of adversity within the household sometimes. And that kind of stuck with me, I think. And then when I went to university, I decided to study psychology. And originally I had decided that I wanted to pursue a degree in clinical psychology. And that's usually, what people think of usually with the stereotype of the clinician and people being treated for depression, schizophrenia, and all that. But when I was on that career trajectory, I realized that I could probably help more people if I were to apply my skill set to the organizations rather than individuals. And I might not have as personal an impact on a single individual, mind you, if I was operating in a clinical position like that. But I probably would have a wide impact on a wide number of lives. So for a number of reasons, I decided that I was going to choose this sort of path. And I think that there's a lot of reward in that too, because there are a lot of people that spend more than the 9 to 5. They're there for sometimes 10 or 12 hours every day.
Well, every entrepreneur is pretty much the long hours, or successful entrepreneurs anyways, early on.
Yeah, and so if what I'm doing has any potential to impact their lives, day-to-day lives, I'm probably having quite a bit of impact, more than I probably assumed I would, than if I went into clinical work. So, I'm very pleased with my job as being somebody who helps others and improves their lives, their day-to-day lives and their working lives.
Yeah, I don't think there's any better vocation or calling than helping better, the human condition.
Right. And so the way that we're pursuing this at Trust Included is basically we're taking a focus of it. Our job is to educate, inspire, and facilitate positive organizational cultures, inspirational leadership, and amazing employee experiences.
That's awesome. Now, your background in PhD research was in mindfulness and resiliency
Right.
in the industrial organizational setting. Can you tell me a bit about that research background and maybe for the sake of the audience, define what mindfulness is and then resiliency? And let's get into discussing that
Sure.
research and how that plays out in a organizational setting.
Right. So leading into this from, I guess, the last question, I had done a bit of adversity research in my undergraduate. I was looking at family systems at the time, and I decided to pursue a resiliency study. So this is looking at the opposite side of things from adversity. So it's like how people, take resilience involves how people are impacted by this negative experience. They take a hit and then they bounce back. So it's a two-part process at least. If they don't experience it as a negative, then typically it's not really resiliency. It's something else like hardiness. And hardiness is a totally different factor. I can get into that in another discussion, but
Yeah.
it's basically like a suit of armor. So you may not notice being a negative experience impacting you at all. And then
Well,
with
and that
regards
might
to,
even be in the same realm as Angela Duckworth's stuff on grit. Just being
yeah,
able to
well,
persevere through some stuff.
yeah, it probably influences how you proceed through experiences of grit. I think you need to. A grit is this idea that you can stick with something for a long time through hardship, through
Yeah.
good days and bad, and I think that all of this is playing a huge role in this. But this resiliency concept is it's what's called a superordinate construct or a superordinate variable. It's a big variable that includes a lot of little variables, and so grit is probably actually even bigger variable if you think about it, because it probably also involves the processes of resiliency amongst other things. But she's the expert on grit. I'm not, and so I'll defer to her on that. But with regards to my research on resiliency and mindfulness is just this other thing where it's being very attentive and aware of the present moment, but in a way that is non-judgmental and very accepting of things. And so you can be able to notice emotions come and go, and you're not judging them for being, good emotions or bad emotions. That concept of good and bad emotions is kind of removed from the equation because that's not really productive. And,
Right.
everything's temporary. And it's that whole the belief that, what's going to come is also going to go. And it's easier to deal with when you're kind of in a somewhat detached, sense of things. You're
Right.
very aware of what's going on, but you're not possessive and owning it in that sort of regard.
Right.
Uh,
The Pete therapy I do with some clients talks a bit about this in terms of the charge that we attach to emotions, and
mhm.
it's kind of taking away the charge, be it positive or negative,
Yeah,
around it, and it's just
it
this is just
is.
what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah. And it's there's a funny video where Jim Carrey is actually, he went to the fashion awards and he kind of mocked them in it, but he's just talking, he's throwing around a lot of metaphysics and words that actually were kind of relevant, because he's like, no, events are just happening. And it's like, yes, they're just happening. They're not good events, they're not bad events. But I thought it was funny that he was using the terminology that I'm very familiar with.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I was looking basically in my doctoral dissertation of integrating a model, a theoretical model. This is just a series of variables that explains how people move through different phenomena. And that model was of a resiliency in my master's. And I tested it and it seemed to do really well. My supervisor at the time had, proposed this model, and I had made some amendments to it, adjusted it, and added in a couple new variables, and it worked pretty well. And I noticed that, this thing might even work well inside and outside the workforce. So it might generalize beyond just the work environment to non-work environment as well.
Excellent.
And so my PhD is also looking at mindfulness. Is like really intrigued by this concept, and I noticed that, some of these components that resiliency tends to function through are also seem to be really similar to these components that mindfulness seems to function through. And so what basically I decided to do is look into what theoretical models are, driving the productive outcomes of mindfulness, and how can they be integrated into a coherent model of mindful resilience is what I proposed it as. And so basically I landed on, this Dr. Shapiro came up with this great model, and it basically said that the more mindful you are, the more likely you are to reperceive events or your situations, things like that, in new lights. And so the more that you're likely to do that, the more you're likely to basically be able to self-regulate your emotions and that sort of thing. The more flexible that you're more likely to be, the more likely that you're going to be more tolerant of distressing sort of phenomena, and the more likely that you are to have a more concrete clarity in the values that you hold towards things. And I thought, and all of these things are beneficial with regards to all sorts of end states, like having less depression, having less anxiety, stress, and
better
all of
decision making,
well-being. Yeah, well, clarity, especially with the values, right?
For sure.
You can imagine how that would impact organizations, especially if you look at a cultural basis for this sort of thing.
Oh.
And so all this sounded, like it was making sense to me. And the more I looked into the mountain of mindfulness literature, it sounded like this is probably the way to go. And so I had integrated the model. I tested the model with a couple thousand participants, and did multiple evaluations. So I did a test retest sort of situation.
And you were saying it was longitudinal and with thousands. So for those non-researchers in the group, that's a high level of evidence when you have a longitudinal study plus that size of sample makes it very significant.
Right. And what was really interesting is that not only did we see changes over time, there was improvements in things in both components of the model. So both the resiliency components and the mindfulness components. There's interesting tiny changes that we saw even in trait components of the resiliency, which traits don't typically change a whole lot if you read to the research about that. But if you happen to think, well, what could be going on here? Well, one of the reasons why traits may be changing is due to something called post-traumatic growth. And that's basically where you might grow from an adverse experience and things like that. That's just one explanation of many. It could have been anything. But I did talk about that in the research. I also used all of these variables in the model to basically predict a number of outcomes. And we were able to predict 50%, 60% of the variance in well-being measures at both time 1 and time 2. Which is fantastic if you consider things. Like, it's a huge amount of predictive power we have. So if you look at a machine learning perspective, using this to predict various outcomes down the road, there's a lot to be had here, I feel. And so, yeah, I was very pleased with the outcomes of that particular research, and I hope to engage in some of that in the future.
Excellent. So in terms of the mindfulness and resiliency research that came out of that, how have you been able to transition that research into working now with organizations through Trust Incorporated to increase, obviously, the level of resiliency and mindfulness in organizations? And what are some of the outcomes that organizations that can build those to, what are the outcomes that they benefit from?
The literature on this is fairly widespread at this point. It became kind of a hot topic for a while in academia as well as in practice. Part of the reason for that is that it's actually one of those things to increase somebody's mindfulness or dispositional mindfulness, or trait mindfulness is what they call it. It's really rather cost effective. It's not something that's going to cost you an arm and a leg. You have to have people who are willing to engage in mindfulness meditation or yoga, or what are also called mindfulness-based stress reduction programs. Formal programs like that might cost a little more, but you can actually notice, and the research shows with a fairly high degree of consistency, that if you're practicing mindfulness for at least 20 minutes a day and you're actually engaging it, you're not falling asleep. It only takes about 20 minutes a day for about 2 to 3 weeks before you start seeing some of these effects in the data. And that's pretty good. And, it doesn't cost you a whole lot. It costs you time, but if you have willing people who are eager to participate in this sort of thing, You can see, benefits in leadership. You can see benefits through, organizational health, that sort of stuff. And it ties into every component of the model that I was saying with regards to the mindful resilience model that I was looking at. It just from a health savings alone, about 20% of the copay or premiums, of the premiums that organizations pay with regards to healthcare in the United States. Organizations are likely to pay 20% of healthcare premiums in the United States. And so if that's the case, then, if you're saving money on people going to the doctor and stuff like that, it really does add up. Depression, anxiety, and stress are three of the mental health symptoms. I checked out my research. What I noticed that they were all, they're all influenced by each of the variables in this model. So one would believe, just from my research alone, that people who are of higher mindfulness, they would be more likely to exhibit lower symptoms of these mental illnesses. And depression is one of the leading mental illnesses in North America right now. It was projected to be by 2020, I believe, as the leading cause of work-related disability leave. So, it's if not the leading one, it was one of the leading ones. So, these all have huge impacts. They're very costly. It yields improvement in bottom line for sure. I think it's just finding the people that are willing to take it on. The one thing that I want to highlight, though, is that these sorts of programs sometimes are used as, Band-Aid fixes or something like that to cover a problem that is like more systemic in the organization. For example, we have, maybe a couple of bad leaders and we don't know what to do with them yet, and stress is really high, or we have, problems, with just processing our employees and treating them well right now. Maybe it's a crunch season or something like that. And mindfulness is good, to have on hand, but it is not an equivalent to actually resolving problems that are long-standing and long-term and systemic. And I should make sure I say that, because there's a lot of people out there that forget that fact. Wellness programs, it applies to wellness programs, not just mindfulness. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, and Ray Dalio, the famous investor and billionaire, talks about the impact that mindfulness and mindfulness meditation in particular has been a critical part of his success and the success of BlackRock. And
Steve Jobs was another one. There's a lot of CEOs that typically you hear that they do that. I believe the CEO of Twitter is also pretty heavy in meditation.
Yeah. So, there's research to back it up. There's tons of anecdotal coming from the practical side. And, and there's lots of different ways, like, the typical ones we hear about are mindfulness meditation and yoga, but, it can be as simple as just getting out of the building and outside for a walk in nature, and that sometimes, and just being quiet.
Yeah, well, on that note, there's a whole another body of literature that I kind of explored and have dabbled in a little bit with, that's called biophilic responses, or human biophilia. Yeah. And it's basically this idea that if you're out in nature, or you're around animals, or you're around plants, you actually are better off for most situational, this sort of things. Like your health values typically improve. If people are in a hospitalized sort of situation, if their window's facing a brick wall versus facing a park, they notice their health is actually dramatically improved. Or if they have, plants inside their room. So these are all really interesting little things that yield changes with regards to human behavior and the human experiences that applies to not only work, but life, broadly speaking. So, I'm a firm believer and proponent of mindfulness. It's not for everybody. There are some very small populations that actually experience mindfulness with a degree of what they have, like side effects. Some people may experience a degree of what psychologists call dissociation, and it's not necessarily pleasant for them. There's also some small amount of research that I've ran into as well that also says that people who are particularly high in anxiety or various particular forms of anxiety may not benefit as much from mindfulness as they would from other things. So this is about knowing, kind of what it's good for and what it's not as good for, and trying to use an educated mindset to approach various problems. If that's also why I say, with regards to programs that you're employing in the office space, you definitely don't want to force anybody to participate in these programs. You want to take the volunteers, the people that are actively willing and interested in participating with them. The oldest psychology joke that I know of is that, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb really, really has to want to change. And that basically applies to these sorts of programs and interventions. With regards to how it integrates into our practice, it depends on the client, their needs. I think, making sure that every company takes the mindful step of being aware of their values, and like not only the values that they articulate on their website or on their wall, but what are their lived values actually. Those are,
and are they congruent with what they have?
Yes,
written?
exactly.
That's the congruence is a big piece.
Yeah, and this may not be a component of a direct component of mindfulness. Mindfulness actually has either anywhere from 1 to 5 different properties that are very specific to mindfulness, but these are more outcomes that are pathways by which they move through. And sometimes you can target those pathways directly too, and that understanding your culture may involve a lot of things. It may involve some workshops. It may involve discussing things and taking a reflective look at things that ties into the reperceiving of things, if you are careful enough.
Well, and it ties into what we talked about too around emotional intelligence too.
Yeah.
And, the World Economic Forum's rating it as one of the top, 10 skills in the next decade.
Yeah, if you look at some of the reports that I've read recently, are that like all the leading countries that are working on AI right now basically label soft skills as the skills that are going to be required for people in the future. So countries like India, China, America, these places are doing really well with AI right now, but they also realize the critical nature and the critical requirement of these so-called soft skills. They're not really soft skills. They're hard skills now. They're concrete skills. They probably always were, and we were probably sweeping that under the rug for quite a while. But they're definitely not what we perceived them to be in the past.
Well, and we gave them this vernacular around soft skills because historically they weren't measured like some of the other hard skills that were easy to measure and quantify. But now there's a ton of metrics, whether it's psychometrics or tools out there that can give, formal measurement and data, to these soft skills, which can actually show, not just a base level to start with, but as people are working on how to actually improve those soft skills, which have been clearly identified as drivers moving forward.
The interesting thing about emotional intelligence is that it and mindfulness are highly correlated. It's really interesting. And part of that is the fact that, mindfulness deals with this attentive awareness component and non-judgmental, with regard being very non-judgmental towards emotions. So if you're very attentive to yourself and to others, and then you're also not judging their emotions, you're understanding them and perceiving them well, then, and it also mindfulness also functions through a property of self-regulation. So self-regulation of emotions is also another big component of emotional intelligence. So you see a lot of similarities with regards to that. There are differences that separate them for sure, but I would say that mindfulness is probably a good way of probably evaluating whether or not the more that you engage in mindfulness, the more likely that you are to be emotionally intelligent. I have to double check the research on that to make sure that I'm not,
well, I do work with JCA Global in the UK, and they have over 25 years worth of data and research in the tens of thousands now. And both mindfulness and resiliency are part of subscales within their metric. And, the research is profoundly, supportive in that regard.
Right. I'm just saying, I know the correlations there, but I would actually want to see, for example, a longitudinal study or even a meta-analysis showing a degree of
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I know Joe Maddox, who's, the author of their book, and that he's doing his PhD right now in this area. So I would suspect the longitudinal and meta-analytics of this are, imminent if they aren't already.
Right. No, I'm
Yeah.
fairly confident as well.
Yeah.
I just, yeah. So it's interesting. All these things are working together. We're doing work in all of these little spaces here. Yeah. So.
Yeah, one of the areas you were talking about when we connected before the podcast was hiring and the idea of personality versus cultural fit in hiring. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I've actually done some research involving personality before, and I've also done research looking at interesting little quirky variables too. I believe I have the only paper published right now that bridges music psychology and organizational psychology. So I was looking in that paper whether personality, whether music preferences, so whether you like rock, whether you like techno, whether you like industrial music or anything like that, and music uses, so whether you use it for just kind of background noise or whether you use it for intellectual purposes, that sort of thing. These two properties, whether they predict organizational outcomes like turnover, job satisfaction, all sorts of things, better or over and above, not better, over and above that of personality. So we were looking at variables like the big five. If you're not familiar with the big five, these are personality variables like openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism. So there's quite a few in there, but and what my research found is that they are, with regards to music preferences and music uses, are able to predict a very small amount of additive variance above and beyond that of personality variables. So there are slight differences between the constructs that allow them to predict organizational outcomes a little bit differently, and that makes them useful in a way. But personality is one of those things that has long been established as a predictor of organizational outcomes, particularly the variable conscientiousness, and to a limited extent, some of the other variables like extroversion and that extraversion, introversion. So each of these variables has a bipolar end. You can be either
it's a spectrum, right?
Yeah. But the personality dimensions that you should be using to predict work-related outcomes, or whether or not somebody's should be hired, should be very much related to the occupation that they're being hired for. And you should make sure that when you're doing this, that there's evidence to suggest that you're making the correct decisions. There's a long-held bias in the research literature that's kind of recognized that people generally prefer extroverted people, even though it may not necessarily be ideal for the role. And there's a lot to be said about that. So you don't want to be using the wrong criteria to hire particular candidates. And I also know, with regards to, you mentioned cultural fit as well. And when hiring for cultural fit, there's two bipolar ends. You get people who are very, very vehement and excited and passionate that you should be hiring for cultural fit. You get people recently that I think they're taking it with a huge defense with regards to diversity, inclusion, promoting these sorts of things. And I can empathize with that, but I do want to say that cultural fit is one of those things that if you don't have it in some regards, it can definitely influence your organization and the relationship that you have with your employees. And so I always give a good example of this would be like, if it's a cultural value that is fundamental to your organization, then you should probably be hiring for it on some level. And you do want to promote diversity. I'm not saying to just like harvest a monoculture of employees. It's a horrible idea.
No, you get groupthink. That's, the research shows that's one of the downsides.
Creativity plummets when you only have like the same person. Yeah. So we try to avoid these sorts of outcomes by making sure that there is some diversity in there. But you do want to hire with regards to some things that revolve around personality, probably, and some things that
and value congruence too.
Yeah. A good example of this that I like to for people to reflect on it or understand this as is basically like, if you're looking for somebody to date, there's going to be some deal breakers. and when you're hiring people, there should be a couple deal breakers in that equation.
Yeah.
It's a long-term commitment. It's a long-term relationship if you're doing it right. And so you're going to want to make sure that they're fit with the same set of values. Not all of them, but a couple. A good example that I try to use when I tell people about this is if you're hiring somebody for the police force, you want to make sure that they're honest. And honesty is a cultural value. So
yeah.
That's just one example. Nurturing might be one for the healthcare industry. There are things that you probably want to look for in that sort of regard. And with regards to diversity and inclusion, it's when you're going to promote the qualities that you want as diverse or inclusive, you have to recognize that you may select a couple variables or maybe a handful of variables that you're going to use as selection-based criterion. And that just means that they're relevant to the occupation, they're bona fide occupational criteria.
Right.
Basically, those are only a handful of criteria. There's a whole lot of other different variables that you can use to be diverse on. And you want people to, think differently, to have things that are different experiences in the past that shape their thinking, that different sets of values, but not necessarily the ones that are fundamental to that particular occupation. So I know that I may have rubbed some people the wrong way with regards to saying like you should hire on cultural fit, but there are some things that are deal breakers. And
absolutely. I remember coming out of high school, I joined the Air Force, and when I was in Toronto for aircrew selection, there was a guy from out east, and he was 6'6", already had his pilot's license, straight A student who wanted to be a CF-18 pilot. Well, he couldn't do it. And the reason for that is one of the bona fide occupational requirements are you have to be able to fit into the cockpit.
Yeah.
And he literally could not fit because of the length of his legs.
Yeah.
And they aren't going to change a multi-million-dollar plane to keep someone happy. They'll just weed someone out. And that's
reasonable accommodation, right? Reasonable.
And it's just not reasonable to, in that there's other, aircraft in that he's able to obviously fly, but that one was the deal breaker.
Right. That's disappointing. And I understand that may shatter a couple, people's dreams a little bit, hopefully not too much, but that's the other thing about values is if you always have the opportunity to work on yourself and to think about your values and are they really the ones that you should be adopting and you can't use those as necessarily saying like this is who I am and I'm fundamentally this person for as long as I live. You can make the change, you can reflect on things, and if you're incongruent with the particular occupation that you want to pursue, you have to ask yourself, are you optimally suited for that particular position, and are you joining it for the right reasons or pursuing it for the right reasons?
Right. And even if you get in and find out afterwards, and I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where you're asked to do something or you're committing to some goal or whatever, and there's something in your gut at a fundamental level and you can't pinpoint it.
Right. And my advice
that lack
is
of
probably the same as you. Leave those situations probably as soon as you feel them. Not
and
that
you
they're
do
strong enough, but you have to make sure that they're strong enough and then you can go for it. I don't know.
That's awesome. Well, in terms of your own success habits and that, you're running, this company, you've had to run the gauntlet of, a PhD, which I can appreciate at this stage. What are some of the success habits that have helped you perform at a high level that you'd like to share? Maybe your top 3.
Yeah, sure. Break big projects down into smaller steps. That's the really big one, I think. And whenever you can do that, because a lot of the times when you break massive projects down into smaller steps, you realize that you have components that you have to learn in order to get to the next stage. What I would recommend though, is that every time you get to a learning component, make the learning is, even if you're not doing something originally in a learning lesson that applies to the project, the big overarching goal. Just because if you're trying to get something new under your belt and you're actually engaged in it, it's more likely to stick. And so,
right. And Gary Latham from Goal Setting Theory talked about this. Like, you have the achievement goal, which is the big goal, but you have to break it down into smaller actionable and learning goals. And that research, Carol Dweck out of Stanford on mindset and learning goal orientation. You're from Ivy, so Gerard Seitz and Gary did research on learning goal orientation as well.
Yeah. Also, I mean, it depends on what you're doing, but they generally find that if you're approaching things rather than avoiding them, and if you're approaching things for the outset of mastering the particular task rather than to outdo your competition, you generally, are going to do a little bit better. And I have some work that shows that as well.
Yeah. Well, one's a lead indicator versus a lag. The achievement's a lag indicator. It's an outcome.
Right. Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, there's a few there that are pretty interesting, but then it depends on what you're doing. But if, for example, you're trying to lose weight or something like that, you can explore all this tech and stuff like that that's coming out. And what I would highly recommend, though, is that you make sure that you're using tech that is validated, not necessarily, the hottest thing on the market, because there's been, stuff that has come out that is not, as demonstrably effective, but people are kind of getting hoodwinked a little bit.
Well, remember the neutral shoes, the Vibram, they had the little toe feet.
Yeah.
There was this whole minimalist approach, and it was literally a fabrication. And they ended up going broke, I believe, because their claims were false and led to many injuries, in fact.
Yeah, well, it's disappointing when stuff like that happens, but not everybody, but many people are out for business. And, the sad thing is that not everybody is as honest and forthright as they should be. And not everybody has done the due diligence of research to do that. So whenever you're using anything, whether it be, a fitness electronic wrist wearable, or whether it be an assessment to track how, for example, your emotional intelligence is developing, you want to make sure that it's a validated measurement, but you should be using measures and tracking things as you go forward. It's a critical part of goal setting, because if you're not tracking things and measuring things, you don't really know whether or not you're making any progress. So definitely find a measurement tool that's effective, reliable, and valid. So is it measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? And is the measure on target every single time, or is it different every single time?
Yeah.
And once you've done that, you have, a good tool that you can use as a benchmarking tool to understand like where you were at day 1, where you might be at day 30, and that can help you tremendously. I always say, and maybe this goes back to my mindfulness sort of work, but just keep in mind where you started and reflect back on that sometimes, because usually the hardest and worst days are already behind you. So it's good to be mindful of that and look back and understand how far you've made it to today. Yeah.
Right. And I think even when we look at, sometimes the gap between the achievement goal and how far we've come, when you look at even your comparable group, you may not have reached that end goal because you were stretching yourself, but how far have you come and how that actually compares. And I know we need to be careful around comparisons and that, but the reality is we live in a world where
people are
are measured and we're compared, whether we like it or not, whether it's positive or not. It just is what it is. And I mean, I could go on a rant about how moving away from, grades and, competitions is creating a lack of resiliency, I think, in children. And
there's a lot of reasons along with
mentality.
that. I mean, it goes to what I said before. If you don't actually experience hardship, are you really experiencing adversity? And so how is that setting you up for resiliency down the road? We don't know. And
right.
I totally hear your comment there. But on that point, as you were saying, it's good to look back. It's good to understand where you came from and how far you've made it. But don't. The other thing that I want to put on there too is if you don't achieve your goal, the big, hairy, audacious goal,
Yes.
that's okay too. I mean, look at how far you came and understand, and really reflect concretely on this. Is your goal actually achievable? Maybe you made that goal and when you didn't have as much experience or knowledge of it at the time, and maybe
Right.
you set the bar way too high that normal people probably shouldn't have. Most people have a range by which they can grow. I'm not saying to not strive to achieve the max of that range, or to,
Mhm.
try and even supersede it where you can. But you just have to be reasonable. And whenever you're setting goals, I always frame it in the terms of this cost benefit analysis of, like, if you have this opportunity cost that you give up by pursuing this goal, and that is any other goal that you could be using your time to be spending on.
Right.
So yeah, you want to make sure that you're prioritizing things and understanding the return on investment that you get by pursuing this goal relative to any other goal that you could be pursuing. And
Right. And not
people
just
have
in
this.
isolation. Don't put
Yeah.
that goal in its own box,
No. You
apart
have to
from
understand
everything else.
the gestalt of everything when you're doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, people have this sort of toxic positivity idea where, like, quitting is bad. No, quitting might be the right
Yeah.
decision under certain circumstances. So you really have to evaluate what the circumstance is. And even if you look at certain sports or certain, I guess, fitness related occupations that are good for making this metaphor, is sometimes in weightlifting, it's okay to take a 2 week break or so, just to kind of get your system to reset. And this can be enormously beneficial for when you come back to it after that. So,
Right.
you got to give your body and your mind some time to rest. And sometimes, if you're pursuing even creative things, it can be really rejuvenating to give it that space to just have it fiddling around or turning in your head in the background, and then you come back to it, and you have all these new and interesting little thoughts that you just kind of percolated on, and they came
Right.
to you.
And
There's some
renewed
research to back that up.
motivation too.
Yeah, this is true too. Motivation is a
Yeah.
huge part of everything, and if you're experiencing problems with regards to motivation, then that can really impact your performance. There's a lot of work to suggest that. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Aaron. Is there any final thoughts or comments you want to give the Hop Nation crew?
Yeah, I mean, I just keep plugging away, and if you are interested in getting a hold of me, you can get a hold of me through my website at trustincluded.com. I'm also on Twitter at @a_J_Halliday, and you can contact me on LinkedIn at Aaron Halliday PhD. Also, I'm running a
And
little
we'll
bit.
make those links available on our show notes as well for this.
Okay, yeah. So thank you for inviting me on the show. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you very much, Hop Nation, for listening. We'll see you next week.